Nicola Sturgeon, you've had the unenviable task of reviewing Unleashed, Boris Johnson's 730-page tome for the New Statesman this week. Is it the man you recognise?
Yes. I mean, if anybody suspects that a ghostwriter did this, you only take a few pages to realise that that's not the case. This is Boris Johnson in his own words. You hear his voice as you read it. That's not always a good thing, I hasten to add. But it is definitely him, with all of the bad jokes and the public schoolboy, insults being chucked around, and a few interesting reflections in the midst of it. I picked it up with a sense of kind of dread and foreboding, thinking, why on earth have I agreed to review this book, given that I now have to read it, all 730 pages? And it might be simply a reflection of my very, 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 very low expectations of it, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, which is not to say it's good, but it was better than I expected.
I think we're both struck, Rachel and I, by how nice you are, actually.
Given... Oh, no! Yeah, I'm going to have to get the draft back and rework it, because that was not the intention. I wanted to be fair. I like reviewing books. I love the kind of intellectual challenge of, wrestling a big book like this is into, a couple of thousand words and trying to get the essence of it. So I really enjoy that process. And, it would have been really easy for me. I'm going to give you an exclusive here. I don't like Boris Johnson. He doesn't like me either, incidentally, so it's a mutual thing. So it would have been the easiest thing in the world for me just to not really read it or skim read it or dip in and out of it and then do a hatchet job. But actually, that would have been doing myself a disservice. So I decided, as I sat down to read it and thinking to myself, this is a public service, actually, because if I read it and review it, other people might not have to. I thought, I'm going to do it fairly. I'm going to try and be objective and, bring my personal insights to bear, but strip out all of my many prejudices about the guy, many well-founded and justified prejudices, I hasten to add. So if I've been nicer to him than you might have expected, then, while that on one level horrifies me, on another level, it makes me think, okay, well, maybe I did the job professionally and well. That's what I'm going to tell myself.
It's always a challenge with Boris Johnson as well, because, as you say, he was incredibly himself in this, and that is Boris Johnson's way of going through the world. He can sell himself. He can bring you along. He can tell a good story. He can be enthusiastic. He can sell his point of view in a way that is very readable. I say this just having read 4 or 5 different accounts of the 2024 election that sort of veer from the very analytical to the very historical or whatever. Like, they're not always the most fun to read. He can write something that is fun to read. That's why he was successful as I hesitate to call him a journalist, but he was. And that's,
he can write.
And he can speak and make a case. It's just that when you look at what it is that he's actually saying, often there are some pretty glaring holes in it that he's managed to sort of skirt over.
Yeah, I mean, to what extent, Nicola, did you feel it was a bit of a work of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, large parts of it border on fictional, or at least they are the world as Boris Johnson wants to believe it was. I mean, take COVID, for example, which is, the issue on which I worked most closely with him, although, certainly after he came back from being ill, and, he writes very movingly about his illness and being in intensive care. He kind of seemed to delegate a lot of the COVID stuff after that to other people, Michael Gove, for example. But when you read it, he gives the impression he was the, 24/7 hands-on Prime Minister steering the country through a pandemic. Now, he might believe that, and, maybe it's true. Maybe I just didn't perceive that from my perspective of being a First Minister who was very much trying to do that. But, I was reading it, and, he was talking about the terrible burden of decision-making during COVID, which I, feel to this day, feel that. He spoke about, as everybody will remember, that terrible Christmas at the end of 2020 when we thought a bit of normality was on the horizon and we had to take that away and effectively cancel Christmas. And he talked about the emotion around that, which I recognise that for me was one of the lowest points of the whole pandemic. And so as I was reading this, I was feeling almost a sense of affinity with him. And then I suddenly thought, hold on a sec, that's not what he was like at the time. And I don't want to overstate this and be unfair to him inadvertently, but during COVID, he seemed to me to be, disinterested, a bit detached from it all, a bit cavalier at times, and not really on top of his brief. And I say this in the review, there's a bit early on in the book when he's talking about his first few months as Mayor of London, and he says, I'm paraphrasing here, that he felt as if he was always skating over the intricacies of the job. That's how he always seemed to me. Somebody who was just never on top of his brief, didn't know the detail, didn't really care about the detail. Now, when you read the book, he paints a completely different picture. He almost gives the sense that he was some kind of micromanager, and he really wasn't.
Certainly that hasn't come out in the COVID inquiry thus far, has it? I mean, it's very much, people have said, I didn't realise a government could be so ill-prepared and, ill-equipped to make decisions.
Yeah. I mean, there's other bits where, look, he's the hero of every experience, of everything he dealt with. He's the central character, and that, I suppose that is a feature of writing a memoir. I'm writing my own just now, so maybe in months to come, people will say the same about mine.
Maybe we could get him to review yours.
I'm not sure he'll be as nice about me as I've been about him. He has this thing, and you may say all politicians do this to some extent. That may be true, but he takes it to the extreme. He takes credit for everybody else's work and successes, but he blames everybody else for his failures. There's a chapter on the Salisbury poisoning.
Yeah.
Episode, which, again, I'm not political soulmates with Theresa May, but I thought that was one of her finest hours. The response was strong. She deserves the credit for it. He doesn't mention her in that chapter. It's all him.
It's really interesting. I don't know if you read it, but Amber Rudd wrote about that precise point, exactly agreeing with you that it was Theresa May. She was decisive and she was actually excellent during that period, that Boris Johnson was nowhere, and that she cannot believe that he is taking credit for that.
It sounds from the extracts I've read and from reading Nicola's review that he genuinely believes his version of events. He has sort of told himself this story where he is the main character, where he is the hero. And if you compare that chapter, the Salisbury poisonings, where he's the hero of that, to the way he writes about Nazanin Zaghari-Radcliffe, where we know that comment he made about her teaching journalism was seized upon by the Iranian regime as an excuse to keep her in prison for many, many years. And we actually, at the New Statesman, we did a couple of really moving interviews with her husband before she was released, and actually indeed after, about how much those comments and Boris Johnson's ineptitude at the Foreign Office personally impacted her. And reading the extracts from that chapter, it was a mistake, but it wasn't really a mistake. He was almost right,
and it wasn't me really anyway.
It wasn't
Gavin
his fault
Williamson.
anyway. And then the rescue, the release, was entirely down to him. So complete abdication of any responsibility for the very real damage he did, coupled with complete and total credit for the eventual outcome.
That was the chapter I found hardest to read. It's almost gut-wrenching, actually, because it was just so craven. He does this a lot. He'll admit a gaffe or a blunder, but then immediately say that it was all because he was trying to tell the truth, or he was the good guy. But he admits that he made a blunder by saying, she was in Iran teaching journalism. But as soon as he does it, he rows back and, that was what her employers were doing, so kind of implication I wasn't really wrong. And then, obviously this was a comment made at a House of Commons committee, and, he basically blames the two officials that were flanking him. Well, if I'd been wrong, they should have jumped in and corrected me, and they didn't. But then, the worst thing is he makes himself the hero of the eventual release, and it only took so long because other people were thwarting what he was trying to do to get her out of prison. I would describe that as the low point of the book. And when you see Boris Johnson for who he really is, and kind of strip away the humour and the gags and all of the things that make us laugh at him and just say, you know what, you're not a particularly nice guy.
What are the other low points?
For me, and again, going back to COVID, he repeats the blatant lie about the vaccine rollout, that it was only possible because of Brexit. We should all be proud of the rapid rollout of the vaccine. And so many people worked so hard to do that. It was a triumph in an otherwise, really bleak period. But it wasn't made possible because of Brexit. And he pours praise, absolutely rightly, on the woman who's head of the medicines regulator in the UK, and said she was brilliant, but she could only do this because of Brexit. You wind the clock back to 2020, and these comments are on the record. She contradicts that. She says that what they did, the MHRA did in approving the vaccine, was done under EU provisions. So why does he feel the need to do that? To take what was a triumph in the midst of a horrible pandemic and besmirch it with a lie? So that, again, because I obviously care so deeply about these kind of things, is a low point. Other good bits of the book. I mean, he explains the whole levelling up agenda better than he ever did while he was in office. He's pretty brutal about Blair's foreign policy, the liberal interventionism in Iraq and Libya. He doesn't, he'll admit getting things wrong, but then never expand on how and why. So he talks about Iraq being a massive foreign policy disaster, and then, claim that he always thought it was, but then just glosses over the fact that he actually voted for it and doesn't say why if he thought it was a disaster at the time. So it's riddled with things like that. Strangely, it's riddled with inaccuracies as well, which, is odd given the processes it must have gone through.
Well, and some of them far more serious than others and far more offensive than others. Getting the number of people who died on July the 7th wrong, it's pretty egregious, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that one is brutal, actually. I mean, some of them are less serious. He gets the month of Dom Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle wrong. For me, and I might wish he was right, but he claims that it was a Labour Scottish government that released McGrahy, the Lockerbie bomber. It wasn't. It was my party. So there's just, and these are ones that I picked up on, and I suppose that makes you think, what else is wrong here that I just don't know from my first-hand knowledge. So that, I thought that was odd. Not odd that he would get things wrong or play fast and loose with the facts, but wrong that these kind of pretty basic errors have made it through to the finished version.
There must be an issue here of publication date, of having a set publication date, and I don't know, from what I've heard about Boris Johnson over the years, he doesn't always meet the deadlines. Are we 8 years into the biography of Winston Churchill or Shakespeare that he's meant to be writing? It's the Shakespeare one. Yeah. He's written the Winston Churchill one.
Can I just say right now, I'm not volunteering to review that one.
we assumed you were going to do all of them, Nicola.
One Boris Johnson book is enough in anybody's lifetime.
The timing point, I think, is interesting, that it is timed for around the time when the Conservatives are having their psychodrama about who's going to be the next leader. We've just had conference season. Extracts of it were dropping during the Conservative Party conference, and the Tory party is trying to figure out what its narrative is going to be for what went wrong over 14 years, not just the election, but why it was that kind of all their voter coalitions seemed to break down. Why is it that they sort of failed to make the progress that they thought they were going to? And there are a lot of stray narratives kind of zooming around the ether, people trying to get their side of the story in. And this is really clearly Boris Johnson getting his defence in for why the election defeat was nothing to do with him, and why in particular the failures over Brexit, because even people who backed Brexit in the Conservative Party will tell you that they don't think it's worked out in the optimum way. And there's a lot of blame on him for that as one of the key.
But what's the response been in the party to the extracts?
Well, the response in the party is very split, because he's kind of a bit of a Marmite figure.
Because obviously it's out today, but I imagine most of them haven't read the whole thing.
There are a lot of extracts going around, but it's him trying to make the case that what went wrong in Brexit was actually David Cameron's fault because Cameron shouldn't have resigned, and the fact that there was no plan. He didn't have a plan. Michael Gove didn't have a plan. The Brexiteers who had won this referendum had no idea of what was going to come next. He kind of brazenly goes in with, well, why did you expect us to have a plan? The government that was fighting the other side should have had a plan. And that's the kind of the chutzpah of that, of saying, yeah, I pushed for this, but it wasn't my job to figure out how to make it work, is something that I think you could only hear from Boris Johnson.
Nicola, we've talked about how he takes responsibility for things that he wasn't responsible for and doesn't own up to his own mistakes. I wonder, particularly with the Salisbury events and the person being responsible for the success of that being Theresa May, I want to just ask you a bit about, is there a tone of misogyny here? Because you write in your review for us, you say, it's often the lot of women in politics to have our physical appearance uncharitably critiqued by men who want to bring us down to size. And Johnson is a master of the art. And I keep reading that he seems to have this obsession with Theresa May's nostrils. How much of this is misogyny, do you think, on his part?
Oh, I think there's a huge streak of misogyny. I don't say that lightly, but he does have a tendency to describe women physically, and sometimes, that's complimentary, other times it's not. The paragraph about Theresa May's nostrils is creepy, frankly. I mean, it's weird. When he has a go at me over COVID, I mean, apparently my entire COVID approach was to get one over on him. I mean, it wasn't. I should say, had that been my approach, I would quickly have got bored, because that was not a hard thing to do back then. But, he talks about me, every time I sort of said something in his world to try to get one over on him, my lips were pursed and my brow was furrowed, and, maybe I should have had a party instead, I don't know. But yeah, so there's a lot of that. There's also, we laugh and say it's gags, and I think I describe it as public schoolboy humour. There's a streak of nastiness in some of his kind of insult chucking as well. You can imagine, I mean, I may be wrong here, and he maybe was nothing like this, but you read it and you can really imagine him being a bit of a playground bully. And so that kind of comes across as well, and it's targeted at, it seemed to me reading it, more at women than it meant. So he's pretty critical of Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove, but there's a certain sort of acerbic kind of venom that he applies to May that he doesn't apply to other people, and I think that is misogyny, to be blunt.
There isn't a long paragraph about Michael Gove's nostrils, is what you're saying?
No, I mean, there's a couple of quips about his specs, and I can't remember, but Michael Gove stabbed him in the back. Arguably Rishi Sunak did, and, he's critical, but, he's quite gentle with them, whereas with May, I mean, he calls her, in the context of a cabinet meeting where she's the Prime Minister of the country, he refers to her as old grumpy knickers.
Yeah.
It's just inappropriate, sexist, and, just a bit crass.
What do you think the point of it is? I mean, he seemingly isn't willing to be particularly honest. There's some factual inaccuracies. He's not remotely introspective, it would seem. What's the point, apart from the £500,000 reserve? I
mean, let me be fair. I guess I include myself in this. There's an element you want to put your side of the story. You want to, and maybe I hope I don't to the extent I think he has. You write your own version of history. Now, that should be broadly true, but everybody has a different perspective on the same event. So it's reasonable, I think, for somebody who's done what he's done to try to put his version into the public domain. I think beyond that, though, I think having read it, and, time will tell whether I'm right or wrong here, I'd be fairly certain that at some point between now and the next general election, there will be an attempted Boris Johnson comeback as leader of the Tory party. He wants to be, the key figure on the main stage. He believes that had he still been leader of the Tory party earlier this year, they'd have won the election. Maybe he's right, and that's a sad reflection of the state of politics. But there's a strong sense that, well, firstly, he feels he was done down. He didn't resign because of anything he'd done wrong. People were out to get him. So there's that. And there's this strong sense of, thwarted ambition even now and unfinished business. So, yeah, I think almost certainly, as of now, will see an attempted Johnson, however many acts it will be at that point.
This read to me definitely like preemptively getting in all the defences that he will need if he does attempt to come back. And really interesting, read Graham Brady's account of his time in the 1922 committee, and one of the things that emerges from that is that in autumn 2022, so after Liz Truss, when there was quite a question, when Boris Johnson was still an MP and there was a question of would he challenge for the leadership again, he did have enough MP endorsements to do that, but he chose not to because he had enough to kind of get to the first round, but not over half. And he felt that the party, the parliamentary party, would be ungovernable and they would just try and oust him like they had done a couple of months previously. And now that the party is dramatically reduced in size, and now that the Conservative leadership race is pretty much wide open, like none of the candidates are the obvious successor, I think he will be looking at the numbers and making a calculation about, is this a better time to try and sweep in, Cincinnatus returning to his plough, and that metaphor that I'm sure crops up in the book, because he does like to scatter classical references throughout everything he does.
I think that analysis is pretty spot on. And the reduced size of the Tory party is quite an interesting point, because he talks about, he doesn't put it quite this bluntly, but why he preferred being Mayor of London to being Prime Minister. In essence, that's because as Mayor, he didn't have a parliamentary party to deal with. He didn't have the House of Commons. He didn't have all the stuff. He was basically a monarch. So he probably will see a kind of reduced Tory party, an easier beast to deal with, and a platform potentially for another run at office. I might be wrong, but that is the sense I think he leaves you with at the end of the book. I mean, there's a bit at the end which is it's almost like a manifesto.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a kind of 10. I can't remember. I think it's 10 points of things that to get the UK, back on track, and it's very deliberately written as a manifesto.
Can I just take you back very briefly to the COVID bit, as painful as it is, because it came out in one of Boris Johnson's interviews, I think with Sky News, where he's quite scathing about the public at one point and says, they really wanted to be told what to do. And I just wonder if that came across to you, that of course...
Micromanaging humanity,
yeah,
he calls it.
and of course, I mean, I look back on that time, much as I think we all try to forget it, and obviously people felt differently, but people were scared and they were looking to government for guidance. I don't think it was we wanted to be told how to run every aspect of our lives. Did that come across? Was he a bit scathing on the populace?
Yeah, I mean, scathing's probably putting it too strongly in terms of the book. But yeah, that sense comes across that, the public were a bit too risk averse, a bit too, he kind of, I don't want to sort of misrepresent him here, but there is a sense of people got a bit too comfortable sitting. He does talk about, sort of well-off people sitting at home in furlough making banana bread and stuff. So I think there is a sense that people kind of enjoyed, being told to stay at home and such like. I mean, he's got this thing about how everybody's become too risk averse. There's a mad section at the start about his time as mayor when, he kind of redesigned, he gives the impression he did it personally, the old London Routemaster bus. And he basically talks about this as being the answer to the fact that kids are too mollycoddled and risk averse. They need to be able to jump off the back of a moving bus again. And the fact that he hadn't been able to do that was why we'd become so lily-livered as a nation.
Obviously.
So,
obviously.
There's a very obvious, it's obvious. And Ken Livingstone is a socialist tyrant because he didn't like bikes, because he wanted everybody on collective systems of buses and trains, apparently. So, there's some genuinely kind of borderline deranged bits in this. But yes, you're right, there is that sort of very, kind of ultra-liberal, just let people go on and do what they want, health and safety, which he keeps referring to as elf and safety. I mean, he's got some of these kind of really childish, wee sort of jokes peppered through it. And so, yeah, to get back to your point, there is a sense of that comes across. If the public had just been a bit more stoic, then we'd have got through this much more easily.
Is there one bit of the book that stands out to you as, I don't know, particularly ridiculous or something you really didn't know? Or what was there one point that you just went, oh my God.
And a continuation of that question, do you really think that there was ever a moment when the UK government was considering seizing a warehouse in the Netherlands that happened to have some vaccines in it? Or is that fantasy?
So I guess, had I not already read that in somebody else's review or a sort of advance of the book, that bit would have absolutely taken me aback and struck me as the most outlandishly ridiculous thing in the book. I mean, I remember well the issue of vaccines being stuck in the Netherlands, and it was a source of great frustration to me because it was seriously frustrating, the supply that we had and the rollout plan. So it was a big thing at the time. But I have to say, I had no idea he was considering invading the Netherlands. Had I known that at the time, I like to think I might have tried to sort of, insert a note of caution or objection. But he actually paints the picture. I don't know if, clearly he doesn't intend to make himself seem ridiculous, but he paints the picture of, him being in his office in Downing Street with kind of the heads of military heads kind of obviously very politely trying to tell him, Prime Minister, you're mad. I think just other bits of it are just like wild roller coaster kind of flights of fantasy. On the upside, I think on Ukraine, he writes really well, and actually, given where we are with Ukraine right now, and the prospects of Trump being re-elected, the prospects of Ukraine being forced to some kind of compromise that rewards Putin, he is a voice that is very, very, very strong in the book and generally for Ukraine's right to defend itself, its territorial integrity, and not to be bullied into a peace deal like that. So he's strong on that, and I think he deserves credit for the UK government's support for Ukraine. But again, there are so many inconsistencies because that doesn't sit easily with the clear adulation he has for Trump. He describes lying in bed somewhere listening to the 2016 election results, and the reason he decides that he must actually want Trump to win is that any time that states were being declared for Hillary, he found himself falling asleep. But then when it was Trump winning states, he was spark awake with adrenaline coursing through his body. And that's how he knew he was, he wanted Trump to win. So that paints the picture of a politician that just thrives on drama and adrenaline. Now, we all do that to some extent, but I think for him, that's the kind of driving force sometimes.